one of the biggest examples before I became a force manager was in Pennsylvania, where I'm, affiliated, was the Stryker Brigade. The 5.6 Stryker Brigade, went to Strykers, and so that was a huge modernization, for the Army National Guard. It was the first Stryker Brigade in the Guard, and so that transformation was years in the making.
Welcome back to Leaders Recon. Today we're here to talk about force management, and we have Lt Col Kropf with us, an expert in all things FM, so I hear. But so we were talking a little bit before the podcast here about your background. So not only do you do force management in the Guard, but you also have kind of an interesting civilian career previously. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure do, yeah. So like I was saying, there's a lot of folks that have a previous life and did different things, before they came to AGR or ADOS or, up at this level, working for the National Guard, Army National Guard. And mine is kind of unique and probably, on the very low level of knowledge of, just amount of people that have their name engraved on the Super Bowl trophy, Super Bowl 43, the Pittsburgh Steelers beat the Cardinals. I was an NFL employee for about 6 years before I came on AGR, and so part of that didn't get a ring, unfortunately, but I got a nice watch, and I think it's more cool that my name's on the Lombardi Trophy. So.
Dang. So what made you decide to switch over to the Guard full time out of that?
Yeah. So again, same thing. We all have our stories. I deployed to Iraq in 2009 into 2010. It was a traditional M-Day, drilling. Up until that point, went to Bosnia also as a young lieutenant. But after I came back from that, went back to the Steelers. So I was with them before, went back to the Steelers, and I saw an opportunity, to be honest with you, that was something I wanted to do. It was ADOS at first, short term, and it just kind of turned into AGR, and then 12 years later now, I'm still cranking it out.
So speaking of cranking it out, so now you're working in force management. Can you give us an overview? So I guess the purpose of this is really learn about what is force management, but I guess that's the first question. What is force management?
Sure. So first off, thanks for having me on. I have to say that up front. Appreciate the time to kind of give that perspective of this functional area. So force management is a functional area. It's really a professional staffer past company command, and it's I say a lot of times you go through school, you get a book definition, and then you get the kind of real meat and potatoes of what they're doing. But so I'll give you the book definition. It's a capstone process to you can see I got some notes here, but establishing field mission ready Army organizations. And so it's like, well, what is that? But there's statutory requirements, from the Secretary of the Army down to the National Guard. The Army National Guard as a component of the Army. You hear things like man, train, and equip. Manning, getting personnel, training, and then equipping with modernized equipment or laterally transferred equipment. So force management is all those things. It's mobilizing, administering, stationing, which is where we put units. But it's in general terms, it's managing change. Because the Army, like anything, is an organization that is constantly changing. And so force managers are managing that change over time.
Well, and with modernization, I feel like there's a lot of that's going on right now. What's the, what are some of the big things that you've seen, as a force manager in FA-50 over the past couple of years? Is there a significant event that you were a piece of in a force structure change or an organizational change that you could highlight for us?
Sure. So we've all probably seen in our formations when we get new equipment, and you have a training package that comes with that. One of the biggest examples before I became a force manager was in Pennsylvania, where I'm affiliated, was the Stryker Brigade. The 5.6 Stryker Brigade went to Strykers, and so that was a huge modernization for the Army National Guard. It was the first Stryker Brigade in the Guard. And so, that transformation was years in the making. I never saw any of that stuff. I was an end user of it when I joined the brigade for that deployment and then stayed with them. But so that was as an end user. There's a lot of stuff that goes along with that, getting that equipment where are you going to put the armories? Can they sustain that equipment? Can they maintain it? can they recruit to it? All that stuff. And that all goes into some of that package. But for me personally, since I've been in FA-50, real quick, fun short story. I worked at the Pentagon before. Right now I'm at the Army National Guard Readiness Center here. And I was at the Pentagon for 2 years. We had a package that modernized maintenance force structure, for the Army. And so it's called a force design update. And that design changes or modernizes that unit. And in this case, I had to staff this, coordinate it, and get this signed by the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. And so that, for me, during my 2 years over there, getting something signed by someone of that level was pretty awesome. That I was able to get it all the way to his desk, and I didn't have to brief him, but I did get it signed by him. So
well, that's kind of interesting, because that was one of my questions I was going to have actually, which is like, okay, so understanding that like force management is adjusting infrastructure change in the military, right? Or force, changes and updating the military. But like, who is it that actually makes decisions on like force change and force structure change and like some of these modernization principles? Like for instance, you brought up the strikers. Like, who is it that was like, hey, we make or this is going to become a striker brigade, and like, how do force managers work with that decision maker, or are they the decision maker?
Sure. So that one there is a pretty complex, like any could be pretty complex decisions and analysis that go into something that big, because you're talking about an entire formation of over 4,000 spaces, and then obviously a lot of equipment, a lot of armories. Those decisions there are coordinated at the highest level, at the general officer 3- and 4-star level, of which state, in taken from a guard's perspective, is going to receive that new capability. And is it going to be all, in one state, stationed? We have, due to the nature of the National Guard, we have units that are split state, between different boundaries, especially when you look at the division, as the large-scale ground combat operations, initiative for Army 2030. Those divisions may be headquartered in one state, but they have pieces, in different parts, especially the enablers. They have pieces of that.
Yeah, I mean, my battalion's the same way. Like, we have one company in another state, so it's like one of our line companies. So
of course, yeah. So it's common, because they always say that we can't move the people, in the Guard and probably Reserve too. We bring units to people. We don't bring the people to those units, because the Guard has the personnel. They're working, most of them, on traditional Reserve, traditional M-Day drilling status, and so they're not moving. They're not PCSing to another location to join that unit in most cases.
Well, that was one of the, that leads right into something else I was going to ask, which is on like, how are the impacts, I'm assuming you're working, you said at the Pentagon, you worked a lot with your active duty counterparts. Like, how did the impacts of force structure change differ from force structure change on the active component, like you're saying, where you can move people around a little bit more easier, versus the Guard, where you have these capabilities, and then you have the domestic capabilities as well for that mission set? How does that change what you do as a force manager when you're looking at all the variables involved?
Sure. Yeah. There's a process like anything in the Army. It goes through various different categories, and I think it's more important for the Army National Guard to look at those closer than it might be even for the Army. And I'll say it this way. It's because of each of the states, territories, District of Columbia, are all different, right? They all have different sizes, scopes, territory, land, the ranges, the different things that they bring to the ability to station that unit in that state, right? And so with active component, you look at, real property on that installation. Can that installation support this modernization change? And so it's important at the active component, regular Army level, but I would think even more important for us, because we are not, we're not organized the same. We're not coordinated the same. And we kind of have to do with what we have, and we can get some military construction money and infrastructure support to handle, in that example with the strikers, that platform, that capability requires different maintenance bay capabilities. It requires maybe different, well, sure, to change different ranges for the capabilities that are on that versus a light infantry brigade or an armor brigade, So that's probably more important for the Army National Guard to look at where to station things because of facilities, because of recruitable population, because of those things that are unique to the Guard. We talk about the Striker Brigade, but that's one, from the maneuver side. But take cyber for an example. You have a low density, very technical, very intellectual, background MOS that it's hard to recruit to. It's hard to sustain to, with civilian education. So another capability that's out there that, is just not maybe right to put everywhere and in all situations.
Well, I know you said these are somewhat complex processes, but could you walk us through, like, you kind of have alluded to some of the different variables that you talk about with the ability to recruit, like the maintenance capabilities, but like if we take a simple force structure change, can you walk us through like the various factors that you typically consider as a force manager and like how they, I guess, train you to, assess like the full scope of impact when it comes to force structure change? Or
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Why don't we do this? Why don't we take a look at something that that was a real world example and where it kind of came and where it went, right? So I'll tell you where it kind of begins a little bit, and so it comes to us, and it's a little bit back in history, when we had the counterinsurgency fight, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so there were certain capabilities that we did not have, and certain structure, it could be manning, it could be equipping, that we didn't have, to fight against that. You look at electric warfare, electromagnetic spectrum type of stuff with IEDs. You look at intel support down to the company level. Those things weren't exactly in our formations before that phase or for that portion of the Army's, reaction, right? And so some of that had to be rapidly, enhanced and rapidly gained. And a lot of it comes from the field, where they say, hey, I need this to combat this problem set, whatever it may be. And so TRADOC is heavily involved, starts there. These force design updates, whether they're minor, whether they're more complex, go through a lot of staffing and a lot of, scrutiny, because you are changing an organization. As a former, I guess I still am an intel officer, I was in Iraq with that problem set of having the need to have more company intel, support down to that level. And so we did that. That was a personnel change, and then we reversed it, or we're in the process of reversing it because of the division fight for large-scale combat operations. So the Army, ebbs and flows over time, but a lot of that change comes down from experience, from AARs, from that review of what that problem is. It goes through that staffing to see if it's feasible. Kind of like when you do MDMP, whether it's acceptable, whether it's sustainable. You look at a lot of these different factors that we talked about earlier. You looked at the facilities, you look at the ranges. If it's a maneuver capability, even if it is a non-lethal capability, you look at ranges. So you look at the recruitable base and the kind of like the fill rate of that the organization that maybe you're changing. So. It's a lot of different factors and a lot of different staffing.
And does that all go in together in some sort of like compiled report, or how does that?
Sure. Sure. So we put that and package it all together when we receive that change package from the Army. So we review something that the Army is looking to change. If we have that capability in the Army National Guard, it's going to affect us. And so we review it. It's like we talked earlier about a force design update. We look at that whole process from the staff up here, some feedback from the state level, and then we put it in front of the decision makers, in front of the director of the Army National Guard, and ultimately the Chief of National Guard Bureau, decide where that will be stationed, where that capability will go.
And you actually brought up a really good point, which is like all these different levels. Can you walk me through understanding? So you're talking about the force design updates. Can you walk me through basically like who makes those and where does that come from, at what echelon? And then how do force managers at each echelon below that work in differ in like what their focus is?
Sure. Talked earlier about the initiation of that. TRADOC is really the place where those are, start and generate from, at the centers of excellence, at capability developments, and even the modernization community with the advent of Army Futures Command. When they bring a new modernized aircraft or weapon
And
system.
where does Futures Command fall under these days?
So they're a separate command now.
Okay.
You know, so they're one of the 4 Army commands. So very big piece of the team. You know, Army Futures Command, TRADOC, ForceCom, you know, Forces Command, and then Army Material Command. So those are the 4 Army commands that work together. You know, when that new material solution or new organizational design, along with all the commands, you know, down to all the maneuver, the divisions, their input, you know, when that comes through staffing. And ultimately, whenever it's done, it does get staffed. It's called worldwide staffing, and it comes to the Department of the Army. And up there in the Force Management Directorate up there, which is where I was at for 2 years, talking about that last FDU earlier in the conversation. And then it gets staffed, you know, a lot of staffing. You got to make sure it's right. At the Department of the Army staff, they coordinate it with the Army National Guard and the Reserve. And if a capability comes to them or is changing something in their formations, we give feedback after we staff it here with our staff. And then ultimately, if it's approved, that's when you start talking about, at that point, really, I guess kind of in the middle of that conversation too, about where it's going to go, you know, where we need to station it. Where is it simple? Is it just a couple personnel changes and it can be absorbed by the state, by the territory, DC, by the unit that's changing? Or is it a large, you know, like the Stryker Brigade? Is it something that's going to have a massive impact, you know, on that state?
And so then at the state level, obviously there's the force managers at the state level. Do they just handle like a lot of the internal moves with units and stuff within the state and like where units are located and stuff, or does that go through review at the Guard Bureau level, or how does that kind of function?
Right, so I think a lot of that coordination is really mostly held up here. That we do receive feedback from the states. There's general officer conversations at the TAG and ATAG director level as far as capability stationing. But ultimately, that process is managed by the Force Management Division. And when those decisions are made, they're in the out years usually. They have time to react. You know, there's not an immediate change where, you know, 1 month a unit has a light infantry battalion and the next month they have an armor battalion. You know, this is something that's forecasted out in the total Army analysis, which is TAA, which is that cycle. Every year we go through this process of evaluating the force structure of the Army. And so, yes, so those force managers at the states are very important. They're called a FIRO, a Force Integration Readiness Officer, and they're that person that is that direct linkage to our division here at the Army National Guard.
And so then, and is that FIRO then, are they handling like, you know, where units are within the state? So like, for instance, you know, like I have a battalion that my battalion has like 3 companies in the state, right? Three line companies in the state, right? Like where these where the units are going to, which armories and that sort of stuff. Is that handled at the FIRO level? With like tags making decisions on that, or how does that kind of work within the state's force?
Well, first off, I'd say a lot of that stuff is probably fixed over time. When you have military construction and an armory at a location, if that location is where that current unit is, and it's just a minor change, or it's a new, you know, you might get a new Humvee or something, you know, whatever it might be. JLTV is a good example. It could come down the pipe for the Army at some point here, or maybe it already has. That's our Force Development Division, our sister division downstairs. They assess, you know, where that change is going to be, and if necessary, provide feedback to where they might need to, you know, move an armory or station something, if, you know, within the state for their changes. But I would say overall that the Army National Guard and the Chief National Guard Bureau, the director and the chief, make those final decisions, you know, on where something is going to be stationed in that state. Once that decision is made, I'm sure there's coordination as to, you know, where in that state from the TAG, you know, is being coordinated, from their G3, their TAG, and from the FIRO's, you know, input to it.
Interesting. So then I guess, you know, we kind of walked through what I'd say the roles, responsibilities of these at the different echelons. Can we talk a little bit about like, you know, your day-to-day? So I know you manage, like you talk about a lot of review, and you were talking about the total force analysis. What is that? What it was called?
Total Army analysis.
Total Army analysis.
Pretty good. So we'll make you a force manager.
One day. So, you know, what is your as a as a force manager at this echelon, like what does that day-to-day operation look like for you? Like, are you focused in on like specific unit problems that get brought up to you and you kind of manage that through its life cycle, or is it more general, ongoing, kind of touching a lot of different pots?
Right, so every day is different. Here I'll say, as an FA-50 at the Army National Guard, not to go into too much detail of our structure and stuff, but I'm the branch chief for the generating force branch, right? So that's the TDAs, the ones that are not typically, and I'll say 99.9% of the time, mobilizing, OCONUS. They might go for a training operation or something, but these are basically training units, RTIs, Joint Forces Headquarters, medical readiness detachments, those things that generate readiness for the operating force. So there's the generating force and the operating force. So up here we have branch chiefs that manage each of the different kind of groups of the operating force, maneuver support, and maneuver sustainment. So my focus is similar to theirs, but it's a little bit different in the sense that they work those force design updates as they come up. They work that coordination with the states that have those capabilities in their portfolios. Mine touches all 54, right? So you might have a state that doesn't have any of or much maneuver structure. They might be all enablers. And so that branch chief never really may talk to that FIRO of that state that often because they don't have that capability. But for me, all 54 are always in my old school, I guess, Rolodex, as you could say. And a typical day is, like a professional staff officer. I think you have another podcast later from, another one of our teammates about force managers, how to become one and the experience. He may touch on it. And it's when you're an FA-50, you are now a professional staff officer. You use all the tools in your toolkit, from a digital standpoint and your computers and staffing to a lot of interpersonal skills, a lot of coordination between points of contact across the Army Guard staff. And so there's a lot of coordination across the Army Guard staff, stakeholders, headquarters, Department of the Army, across the way to the Pentagon. And then, of course, to the people that we really rely on the most that know what's going on at their levels, the 54 FIROs and folks in their shops.
You brought up a really good point. You're talking about tools and stuff. So like at the unit level, right? If I'm trying to understand like, hey, my force structure might be changing a little bit. I look at like the MTO for the next few years, and there's like small little changes, like, oh, I lose a person here, or I gain a weapon system here, or whatever, right? Like, what are some of those tools that unit level leaders can use to help them understand like how their unit is getting managed out for the next few years?
Sure. Yeah, that's the biggest tool that most force managers would say to view your force structure and we call it the out years, is documented 2 years out, which is FMS Web, Force Management System, and then Web. So it's a CAC-enabled system. I'm not sure how you gain access to it. I guess it's been so many years ago as a force manager. But your unit identification code, your UIC, and it's for MTO or TDA. And you can go in there and you can see, hey, this is the force structure I have. This is the equipment that I'm supposed to have. Maybe it might not be on hand, but this is what you're supposed to have from the Army's structure. And so that's probably the easiest way for any leader in the Army National Guard to look at their unit and look at what MOSs they're supposed to have. Look at what ranks and grades and how they're structured in the out years. Now, further out in the out years, we just don't document it that far out because change happens, right? And so we may have a plan that has to be adjusted. So there may be something that is 4 or 5 years out down the road that we kind of have a plan, but it's not finalized yet. So
see, that's what I really want to know about, sir.
Yeah.
Like, I've been hearing for like, what is it, like 3 or 4 years now. I've been hearing, light tanks are coming to the
Sure.
IBCTs, right? And what can you tell us?
Yeah, so don't want to get ahead of any senior leader decision makers, and I'm purposefully being coy about it because it's there are capabilities out there that aren't even developed yet, and it's, as we talked about before, about the force design updates and the material solutions that might change as the national security strategy, as the presidential budget, and as those things evolve over time, ebb and flow. We have that opportunity. We talked earlier about Futures Command, looking at those capabilities that are at least 10 years down the road still. And that might be 10 years down the road for the regular Army. For the Guard, not in all cases, but it may be, a couple of years after that.
And can you actually, alluding to that, can you tell us a little bit about force management when it comes to like modernization specifically, right? Like there's obviously been this whole Army modernization strategy. We've talked about modernization. From a force manager's perspective, as we look at modernization with the ACT component and the Army National Guard, like, are those going to happen concurrently? Is it going to be a decade behind? Like, what are some of the I know
you're asking me some tough ones, Kev.
I don't know.
There's no softballs here.
I don't know if you could answer that, but or not. But
yeah.
What's kind of your thoughts on that personally?
Sure. So we've been at this for over 20 some years now, and obviously there's a little bit of an inflection point now for the Army National Guard, right? So we've served faithfully, in the capacity to be an operational reserve for 2 decades now. And while there may be that inflection point, we're still obviously very busy, and we have that dual mission role, for the governors, for our states, to protect the homeland, but also to provide ready forces for the combatant commanders. So with that said, there are capabilities that if we have that platform, let's just use maybe a rotary wing aircraft. And if the Army is modernizing over time to one that can fly further, fly faster, use less fuel, higher elevations, maybe there's unmanned teaming aircraft, all these different things you might find, that the Army could have at some point. And you brought up one earlier about light tanks and long-range precision fires, all these different things, the Army of 2030. So, I would say that you look at those things that are coming out, and you'd love to have an opportunity to be on that kit, at the same time that the regular Army receives that equipment. And that may be the case for some units. And again, this is so far out in the future. Some of it's closer to us and some of it's further out. But it is all really on that modernization strategy that the Army is going to come out with. And they come out with every year, and they look at, priority units and which units are, more ready than others, and different components. And it does come down to resources at some point as well. So, some of these are so far out in the future still that even the regular Army doesn't even have an idea of how much or when they're going to receive that, because they may not even bent the metal yet on some of this new equipment.
Well, and then, you brought up a really good point, and that's where, I guess from the unit level, right? So, I serve as a company commander right now, right? So we're always on the receiving end of our force structure, this change, we're moving to this armory, we're doing X, Y, Z, right? And I think a lot of soldiers don't get a full grasp of, the extent of staffing and decision that goes into my unit's changing, I'm losing this capability, I'm getting, this weapon system versus this weapon system now. And I was hoping you could maybe address that a little bit, just having seen things both as the end user and now staffing at, the highest levels here. What are some of the things that you can kind of provide insight for, first line leaders when it comes to understanding how force structure change is being utilized to try to, better the Army National Guard over the long term?
Right. No, so I think that when you look at advice and kind of lessons learned from when I was at the company level as well, a few years ago anyway, I think that line of communication, if leaders are looking at, hey, is there anything in the future I need to be prepared for, to get the right personnel in the right locations and coordinate with, my battalion commander, my S3 at those levels. They're having that line of communication and that talk back through their state leadership at the either division level or separate unit level, to where they can kind of forecast and maybe see. Some of it, unfortunately, is a couple years down the road. And so when you look at what position you're in, you still want to set the conditions, for success for the person that may follow you, to where, I may not see that modernized equipment. That's going to need a lot of focus and new equipment training and care and maintenance to it. But I know the person after me will, right? And so as time goes on and you prepare as a company or battalion command level staff, you almost have to really have your, leaning forward in that foxhole and trying to look and see, hey, maybe you know that FIRO at the state. Maybe you know somebody up there that says, hey, yeah, you guys are getting this in 25. Another example, it's the best way to describe things, is back as a young lieutenant in Signal Battalion in Pennsylvania. And we received the new modernized signal packages. As modernization came out, the Guard received that JNN packages, and we had to turn in old equipment, make sure it was TI'd and ready to go, so we could turn in cleaned, ready. That's the forecasting that those leaders down at that level, hopefully are communicating. Down is like, hey, here's the training year. This is when you're getting it. This is when you need to manage your troops and soldiers to say, hey, I need you to be available during these times because we're training up on this new equipment we're getting. It's going to be awesome, and it's going to be a good annual training.
Yeah. So
that's exciting times for a unit that is getting, new kit. It doesn't have to be something as big as that. It could be just a new weapon, new individual weapon system, that they have to go through at the range to learn how to fire differently. So
we just did that in my unit.
Okay.
We did this was new unit stood up, right? 17 fieldings in 1 year, right?
Okay.
So all sorts of, basically drill for a year was a lot of just okay, we're doing training on this new weapon system, we're doing training, we have new equipment coming in, we have this, right? It's really interesting to be a part of that and see kind of the changes that evolved in standing up a battalion from the ground up.
Yeah, definitely. To be in a leadership position when that change comes, you got to be ready for it. You got to have the right people. It's going to take a lot of coordination with the full-time staff because they're the ones on a day-to-day basis are communicating with us here at the division, at our division, and in the equipping division there at FD, to make sure that it is synchronized. Because you're going to lose some readiness at that year. You're going to be training new personnel. You're going to maybe be sending more people to school to learn how to use that stuff, or a second annual training. So I would say it's very exciting. Every time we've gotten new kit, it's a brand new thing to play with.
So you mentioned FMS Web, and you mentioned talking with your FIRO and stuff. But for those that are wanting to understand more about force management, that acquisitions process, some of those things, do you have some recommended resources or reading that you'd advise soldiers to go check out?
Yeah, sure. I think it's in digital version. It's on my desktop, on my computer, and it's on my desk, and I use it every day. It's a book called How the Army Runs, and it's kind of interesting how how the Army runs, how it really runs, according to this book. It's not going to tell you everything, but it is really the Force Manager's Bible on everything there is to go to talk about definitions, processes. Are they followed exactly that way? Not necessarily in all cases, but I believe it's in digital print on the Army Force Management School website as well.
Okay.
And I'm sure you could find that through your local browser or whatever it is. But we use it all the time, and it does have great use, and it could be in really useful tool for any leader at any level to learn more about the processes and stuff like that. So
solid. And then last question. Do you have you kind of hit on this already talking about leaders, but do you have advice for leaders really at any echelon when it comes to guiding units through force structure changes and just the principles of dealing with force management as a whole based on lessons that you've learned?
I was the end user of a couple, like I talked before. I used two good examples. I would say that from my perspective now, I just that communication, I think,
Okay.
Being prepared, for when those changes happen. So whatever role you're in, if you're the company commander, you're the company XO, you're a platoon leader, you're a battalion staff, that you can forecast when those things are coming. It's hard to remember exactly how they went, or if I just fell in on new stuff that I really didn't have to train on. Because I really wasn't using it per se, but I think if you're in those positions now, in contact with your full-time support staff, or if you're at that level, that communication back to the force management and the force development divisions here is crucial. The more that you communicate back to us, the more we're able to inform and advise on those changes as they're coming, so that you can be better prepared for all the soldiers that are in your command and units.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate you coming on and sharing some of your experiences with us.
Thank you. Actually, this was fun. I enjoyed it.
If you would like more information on any of the topics discussed today, please visit our social media pages in the links below. Tune in to Leaders Recon over the next few weeks as we bring in today's leaders and pioneers to discuss their experiences, share their wisdom, and help you grow as a leader. If you like this episode of Leaders Recon, please don't forget to subscribe below and leave us a 5-star review. You can find us wherever you listen to your favorite podcast.